Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Tim Morgan, once again with the TorqueSim SR22 G3. Right now I want to give a special shout out to Steven from TorqueSim for taking the real 171 Mach Alpha and bringing it into X-Plane. I'm very happy with his work. The detail is great. I love it. So today we're going to be taking 1 Mach Alpha on a trip from Siskiyou County Airport, where we are right now, to Portland. And on the way, we're going to learn how to do flight planning, performance planning, and fuel planning, both with ForeFlight and manually using the tables if you don't have ForeFlight or you just want practice doing it the old-fashioned way. So the first step in all this is to plan our route. If we bring up ForeFlight and we go to the maps page, a lot of people who use ForeFlight use the route advisor to plan their route. And so they simply stick it in and they go to the route advisor. And you can see here that the route advisor basically has its strategy for how it chooses routes. If there's a preferred route, it uses it. Otherwise, it kind of just picks fixes, sort of randomly spaced along the route, and then chooses a departure and arrival if there's one that matches. So you can see here the route advisor has chosen just a couple of fixes along the route. They don't really line up with an airway or anything. They're just sort of more or less on the path that we would want to fly. Now, this works in some places. Mostly it would work in like the Central Valley or the Rockies, where ATC doesn't really have to sequence you with other traffic as much. But if you try something like this in San Francisco or New York or Los Angeles, it's probably not going to work. Another thing people do is they look at previously cleared routes from ATC. You can get this from ForeFlight or Flight Plan Go or SimBrief, and it'll show you routes that other people have taken, like turboprops, jets. Looks like no Pistons have flown this route recently, but you can see someone that was able to be cleared direct and other people have filed different arrivals. And lastly, of course, you can look for Victor Airways or Jet Airways along your route of flight. And so you see here, if we start at Rogue Valley VOR, it looks like we can follow Victor 23 all the way up to Portland. And so you can find these Victor Airways or the high altitude jet airways on the map and ForeFlight, or you can download the FAA's IFR low and high charts to see where these Victor Airways are and where you can fly them. And Victor Airways are pretty much the only way to fly these routes if you're not slant golf, if you don't have a GPS on board. Anyway, we are slant golf, so we could theoretically just use this route that the ForeFlight route advisor has chosen for us. But if we go into the procedure advisor and take a look at the arrivals for Portland, you'll notice these arrivals go all the way down to Siskiyou. So some of these arrivals, like O-City 3, start all the way down at Siskiyou. We could just make pretty much the entire route an arrival. And so if we take a look at the O-City 3 arrival chart, you'll see there's a feeder leg starting at Rogue Valley, which is right next to Siskiyou. There's another feeder starting at Klamath Falls, also right next to Siskiyou. Either of those could be used to take us into the Portland area, where we would then get radar vectors for the approach. However, if you look, you'll see that on the Rogue Valley leg, we need to be up at flight level 230, 23,000 feet. Now, the SR22 can cruise at flight level 230, but we're not going to get that high in this short distance from Siskiyou Airport. And the leg from Klamath Falls is flight level 310, which the SR22 just can't get to. Crossing Moxie, though, the maximum altitude becomes 10,000 feet, 6,300 feet if we don't need nav aid reception, which we don't because we're flying via GPS. So what we can do, instead of filing the arrival from Rogue Valley or Klamath Falls, Moxie is an approved initial point for the arrival. So we can just file the arrival from Moxie and make the trip to Rogue Valley VOR just part of our flight plan. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to set Moxie as the initial fix for the arrival, and we will add Rogue Valley VOR as our one and only en route fix. So we'll just fly direct from Siskiyou Airport to Rogue Valley VOR, and then from there we'll fly to Moxie, where we will start the arrival into Portland via O-City 3. Now, in terms of minimum altitudes, if you're flying along Victor Airways, you would use the minimum altitudes for those airways, which you can see on the IFR charts. So for instance, if we were flying Victor 23, like I had proposed earlier, you can see for this leg of Victor 23, the minimum en route altitude, or MIA, is 7,000 feet. My point is, if you're flying Victor Airways, you need to file an altitude that keeps you above the MIA, or at least the MOCA, the minimum obstacle clearance altitude, for each leg of these airways. We're not following Victor Airways, though, we're flying directly from the airport to Rogue Valley VOR and then from Rogue Valley to Moxie. So instead of using airway altitudes, we need to use the MEFs, or maximum elevation figures, in each quadrant. So as you can see here, the first quadrant we're going to be flying through has an MEF of 11,800 feet. And then the second quadrant has an MEF of 11,500 feet, and the rest are lower. So for off-airways flying, we need to be higher than the MEF by 1,000 feet, by 2,000 feet if we're in mountainous areas. So we would need to be about 14,000 feet or higher to fly this part of the route off-airways, because this is a mountainous area. Now, beyond that, any altitudes between the minimum altitude that you can fly, which in this case is 14,000 feet, and the maximum altitude that the turbo-normalized SR22 can fly, which is flight level 250, any altitude range between there you can choose for your cruise. And so you would choose an altitude range that either minimizes the time or minimizes the fuel, depending on which one you want to save more of. And if we go to the altitude advisor in ForeFlight, it does the math for us and figures out which altitudes would be best for time and for fuel. So it looks like if we were to cruise around 10 to 12,000 feet, we'd be saving the most fuel and the most time. But of course, we need to be above 14,000 feet, so we're going to choose 16,000 feet as our cruising altitude, just to make sure that we clear all the terrain en route and also we save as much fuel and time as possible. With that done, now it's time to do our performance planning, figure out how much gas we need on board and how long it's going to take us to fly this route. Obviously, ForeFlight does all of this for us automatically, and I'll show you how to do that in a bit, but I thought we should start off by showing you the manual way, the hard way, using the tables. The turbo-normalized SR22 comes with a Pilot Operating Handbook, or POH. You can Google for the SR22 G3 POH and download it. But because it's turbo-normalized, it also comes with a turbo-normalized supplement, which includes revised performance data. That's the Tornado Alley Turbo SR22 supplement. You can Google that and download it too. That's going to give you all the performance data that you need to make these calculations. So in order to make these calculations, we're going to need to calculate first the amount of time, fuel, and distance it's going to take us to climb to our cruising altitude, and then the amount of time, fuel, and distance it's going to take us to cruise. Some airplanes have a time, fuel, and distance to descend table, but the SR22 and the turbo supplement don't. So I'm just going to use the cruise values all the way to Portland. And that's going to work out more or less okay because I don't reduce power when I descend. I stay at cruise power the whole time and just take the faster descent. All right, so we go to the Tornado Alley Turbo supplement, and all these POHs and supplements, they're all ordered the same way. So section 5 is always going to be the performance data. So we move over to section 5 and we've got our performance data. Now it starts out with the time, fuel, and distance to climb table for a lean of peak climb, and on the next page we have the time, fuel, and distance to climb table for a rich of peak climb. Now we're in a mountainous area and I want to be able to clear terrain as quickly as possible, so I'm going to plan a rich of peak climb. So in order to use this table, we need to calculate our climb to 16,000 feet, and then we need to subtract out the fuel we don't need to climb from airport elevation, because this airport is at 2,000 or 3,000 feet elevation. So if we look at the table, you can see to get to 16,000 feet, it's going to take us 17.5 minutes, 10.4 gallons, and 42.6 nautical miles. Let's write that down. All right, now we need to subtract out our baseline from the climb data. Siskiyou Airport is at 2,600 feet, so we'll interpolate between the 2,000 and 3,000 tables on this chart. So for time, it's between 1.8 and 2.7 minutes, which is 2.3 minutes. For fuel, it's between 1.1 and 1.6 gallons, which is 1.4 gallons. And for distance, it's between 3.7 and 5.6 nautical miles, which is 4.7 nautical miles. So now we can subtract these two and get our totals. So that gives us our total climb fuel. Next, we need to calculate our total cruise fuel. Now to do that, we need to know how fast we're going, how far we're going, and how much fuel we're burning once we're up in cruise. If we go back to the performance supplement for the Tornado Alley Turbo, we get to the cruise performance tables. There's no rich of peak cruise. The only cruise you do in the Tornado Alley Turbo SR22 is a lean of peak cruise. And so we can go to the table for 16,000 feet pressure altitude, and you see there that we can choose between 3 different percent power settings, 85%, 75%, and 65%. These all correspond to 3 different fuel flows. Now, The 85% power setting is at 17.6 gallons per hour, and I can tell you from personal experience that I cannot make this aircraft cruise at 17.6 gallons per hour without exceeding my personal CHT limitations of 380 degrees. So that's out. So that leaves us with 75 or 65. I like to cruise at 75% power because 16 gallons per hour works out nicely and keeps the airplane pretty much right at its maximum temperatures and getting maximum performance without the engine getting too hot. So that's what we'll use. So at 16 gallons per hour, our airspeed now depends on the temperature at 16,000 feet. We get ISA, which is International Standard Atmosphere, ISA plus 30 and ISA minus 30. The International Standard Atmosphere is just a fictional atmosphere that represents sort of an average, and you can be at temperatures above or below that average. Now, if you really want to get manual, of course, what you would do is look at the temperatures and winds aloft for various points along your route and average them out. But that's kind of outside the scope of this video. You can look at the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge if you want to learn how to calculate wind components and do stuff like that. But to keep it simple, I'm just going to pick an airport about Midway, Eugene. And if we go to the weather, go to the winds aloft, you can see that at 16,000 feet, it's going to be about ISA plus 13, so 13 degrees above standard. And you can also get the winds at 16,000 feet by interpolating between those two values. And again, you would use those winds aloft to calculate your ground speed from the true airspeed and know how long it takes to fly, but we're not going to bother with that right now. So we're just going to say it's ISA plus 13, which we can call ISA plus 15, and just interpolate between those two table values to get our true airspeed. And if you go back to the 16,000 foot table, you can see that puts it between 185 and 191, which is 188 knots for our cruise speed. So that's the cruise speed we can expect. And again, that's true airspeed, so it doesn't account for headwinds or tailwinds. We would have to factor that in our calculations. Fuel flow is always going to be the same 16 gallons per hour. So once we know how long it takes us to make the flight, then we can calculate how much fuel it's going to be. So I'm just going to pull the estimated time en route from ForeFlight. It says 1 hour and 27 minutes en route. And I'm just going to take that and put it into our scratch pad. Now for 1 hour and 27 minutes en route, that's the total that ForeFlight gave us. We have to subtract out the 15.2 minutes we spent climbing to get our actual cruise time. That gives us a cruise time of 78.1 minutes. Now at 16 gallons per hour for 71.8 minutes, we're going to burn 19.1 gallons of fuel. And again, we're considering the descent to be part of the cruise, but if your POH has a time, fuel, and distance to descend table, you can use that for the descent portion. Anyway, let's take our totals. So the total time is just what ForeFlight calculated for us. It's just 87 minutes. And our fuel estimation comes out to 28.1 gallons. The next thing we need to do is add fuel for our alternate and for our reserves. Now, the FAA requires you to have an alternate if the weather is below certain minimums at your destination airport. And you can Google the 1-2-3 rule if you want to learn more about that. The weather at Portland right now is above the 1-2-3 rule, so we don't need to plan an alternate. But I'll plan one anyway, just so that we can get some experience with that. In addition, even though the FAA only requires you to have a destination alternate and only if the weather is bad, it's always a good idea to plan as many alternates as you think you'll need to avoid any threats you perceive along your route. So for instance, if I was worried about running into icing along the Cascades, I might plan Bend Airport off to the east as an alternate I can divert to if the ice gets really bad off to the Cascades. So when planning your alternates, you should also think about your en route alternates, but in terms of FAA fuel requirements, you only need to add additional fuel for a destination alternate and only if the weather is below the 1-2-3 rule. So let's plan Salem as our alternate. So we would head back to Salem in the event that we couldn't land at Portland. And I'm just going to use the rubber band tool here and quickly get a distance to Salem. So it's 44.7 nautical miles to Salem. And we go back to the cruise tables to figure out how much time it's going to take us. I'm not going to worry about climb or descent because we won't climb that high to get to our alternate. Let's just assume we climb to 4,000 feet to get back to Salem. Now, if we're diverting to Salem, we're no longer worried about time. We're worried about fuel now. So we're going to use the best economy fuel flow setting of 14 gallons per hour and 65% power. We'll get there a little slower, but we'll save gas. So again, interpolating between the ISA and ISA plus 30 columns gives us a true airspeed of 159 knots. And again, normally we would factor in a headwind or tailwind component to get our ground speed, but I'm going to skip that for this short trip to the alternate. So at 189 knots, to go 44.7 nautical miles, 14.2 minutes. And again, we're burning 14 gallons per hour, which means in 14.2 minutes, we would burn about 3.3 gallons of fuel. And lastly, we want to include our reserves. The FAA requires you to have 30 minutes of reserves if you're VFR, 45 minutes of reserves if you're IFR. I like to carry an hour of reserves because it makes the math easier. So an hour of reserves comes out to 16 gallons at 16 gallons per hour. If we take all that, now we can sum up our total fuel. So if we add the flight fuel and the alternate fuel and the reserves fuel, we get our total fuel requirement of 47.4 gallons on board. Let's see how that compares to what ForeFlight would give us. Let's go to the maps page, take our flight plan, and throw it into a flight. We'll add Salem as our alternate. And you can see here that it's given us a total fuel requirement of 52 gallons. It predicted 26 gallons of flight fuel, whereas we predicted 28 gallons. The big discrepancy is the alternate fuel. It predicted 9 gallons to go to the alternate, whereas we predicted 3.3 gallons. Now, ForeFlight is kind of opaque as to how it calculates your alternate fuel. You can't set the route or the altitude you fly, and you can't set the power setting, so it's no surprise that its alternate fuel calculation is very different from mine. But as you can see, the reserve fuel is the same. We'll use ForeFlight's number because it's more conservative and because I trust ForeFlight more than my own math, so we'll put 52 gallons of gas in the airplane. One other thing you see when filing a real-life flight plan or a VATSIM flight plan is the fuel available field, which asks you how much fuel you have available in terms of hours and minutes. So to calculate that, I just keep it really simple. I assume that I burn 16 gallons per hour, and I ask myself how long can I stay aloft with the amount of fuel I have on board, assuming I burn 16 gallons per hour. So assuming we have 52 gallons of fuel on board, like it says in ForeFlight, that means we have a total endurance of 3 hours and 15 minutes. So that's what I would put in the fuel available field on VATSIM or in a real-life flight plan. The last pre-flight thing I want to show you is calculating your takeoff performance. And again, you can do this with ForeFlight if you have a Performance Plus plan, or you can do it manually. I'll show you how to do it manually first. So the Tornado Alley Turbo Supplement does not include its own takeoff performance data, so we would just use the data from the POH. Again, Section 5 is the performance section, so we would go there and look for our takeoff performance tables. All right, here's our takeoff distance tables. They give us one for 3,400 pounds and one for 2,900 pounds. So you have to know the weight of your airplane plus its fuel plus its passengers in order to use the correct table. We're going to be very close to 3,400 pounds, so we'll use that table. Now this table is in pressure altitude, which can vary from actual altitude depending on the pressure level, but it's never going to vary by more than about 500 feet in normal conditions. So we can just interpolate between the 2,000 and 3,000 foot tables again. Now the temperature right now at Siskiyou County is 29 degrees Celsius. So going back to our chart, if we use the 30 degrees Celsius column, we can interpolate between 1395 and 1542, which gives us 1,470 feet. Now we can adjust that for the headwind. Now there's a 16 knot headwind at Siskiyou right now, which means we can subtract 13% from our takeoff ground roll. And taking 13% off of 1,469 gives us an adjusted ground roll of 1,278 feet. If we go to the plate, you see the runway is 7,500 feet long, so obviously takeoff distance is not going to be a factor here. You can also do this calculation in ForeFlight. If you have the Performance Plus plan, just hit the takeoff button, choose the runway you're going to use to take off, and as you can see, it calculates a ground roll of 952 feet, a little shorter even than what we calculated. All right, with that done, it's time for the final step, which is to determine and brief our departure procedure. As you can see, Siskiyou is in mountainous terrain, so we need to be thinking about our departure procedure. And if you go to the plate, you can see there is a published obstacle departure procedure for runway 35. Now, With these textual obstacle departure procedures, they don't have a picture associated with them, so I like to go to the maps page and draw the picture. So you can see here, this is Montague NDB. It's kind of on the extended center line for runway 35. And so when we take off from Siskiyou, we're pretty much going to be right on course. We won't have to do a turn. So it's more or less a straight ahead climb to 7,000 feet, and then a right turn direct to Montague NDB while climbing to 10,000 feet. Now we're going to fly this obstacle departure procedure until we get radar contact from the center controller, and at some point he'll start giving us vectors once we're above the minimum vector altitude, and then we'll be on our way. All right, with that all done, it's finally time to fly this flight and see how that fuel calculation works out. All right, inside the cockpit, I do want to give another shout out to Steven from TorqueSim for just matching the interior of the real 1 Mike Alpha so wonderfully. This just looks amazing, and it makes me feel right at home. So let's start up the aircraft just like I've done in all my other videos. I have an intro to the SR22 video and an advanced topics video you can watch if you want to learn more about how to fly the SR22. Oakland Center, Cirrus November 171 Mike Alpha, Siskiyou ready to copy IFR to Portland.
171 Mike Alpha, clear to the Portland Airport is filed. Maintain 16,000, departure frequency 121.4, squawk 4766.
171 Mike Alpha cleared to Portland is filed. Maintain 16,000. Frequency 121.4, squawk 4766.
Cirrus 171 Mike Alpha, read back correct.
All right, we'll park the airplane off to the side here and do our run-up. Because it's a fairly warm day out, it's a good idea to park the airplane into the wind to ensure we have enough engine cooling during the run-up. So I'm just going to come to a stop here. Straighten out the nose wheel so that we don't put too much pressure on it when we accelerate the engine. Set the parking brake and we can do our run-up now. So let's go to the flight plan page and set up our route. Let's add the arrival now. And we can expect to get runway 28 right because that's going to put us close to Atlantic, which is where we're going to park. And now if we review the flight plan, we've got everything we need. Now, one other thing I'm going to do is put the Montague NDB in the flight plan as well so that we can fly off of the Montague NDB as required by the obstacle departure procedure that we're going to fly. There's no ADF in this airplane. Very few airplanes these days have ADFs in them, so we need to use GPS in lieu of ADF to know our location relative to the Montague NDB. So just after Siskiyou, I'm going to put in Montague. And what I'm going to do now is activate that leg and turn OBS mode on. And so because OBS mode is on, we can kind of treat Montague as a VOR now. And if you look at the departure procedure, it says we have to fly via runway heading and bearing 356 for Montague. So we're going to set this course needle to 356. And that should more or less center the needle. And now we can use the nav mode to fly outbound on this 356 course until we get to 7,000 feet where we'll start our turn. Because we're doing a full rich climb, I'm not as worried about cooling, so we'll climb at 120 knots and get some extra climb rate out of the engine. And we were cleared all the way up to 16,000, so we'll bug 16,000. And with that, we've got the navigation radios and GPS set. And we are now ready to brief the departure. So this is going to be a departure from runway 35. We're going to rotate at 70 knots. Airport elevation is 2,600 feet, which means flaps up at 2,800 and caps is available at 3,200 feet. We'll use standard abort procedures. We'll abort for any red except fuel flow or manifold pressure, and we'll go for any yellow. If we do get a fuel flow or manifold pressure warning, we will retard the throttle once we are safely in the air and clear of any obstacles. We're going to climb at 120 knots, rich of peak, outbound on the course dialed into the CDI until we're at 7,000 feet. Threats for this departure are going to be the mountainous terrain, which we'll mitigate by using a rich of peak climb, and the complicated departure, which we'll mitigate by maintaining situational awareness using ForeFlight and the GPS. All right, that concludes our takeoff brief. Let's taxi up to the runway, get our departure clearance, and go. Oakland Center, November 171 Mike Alpha at Siskiyou, ready for departure.
171 Mike Alpha, release for departure, current flight if not off in 5 minutes. If not off in 5 minutes, advise intention to 10 minutes from now. On this frequency, change to advisor frequency approved.
171 Mike Alpha, clear for departure, off in 5, advised by 10. Siskiyou County traffic, Cirrus 1 Mike Alpha, taking runway 35 for the obstacle departure procedure, Siskiyou. Let's go mixture, flaps, lights, trim, transponder, doors and windows, pump, and timer. Verify final is clear and there's no one on the base or the downwind. Alright, RPM, engine gauges, airspeed alive. .70 knots rotate, positive rate. .2800 flaps up. We'll retard throttle to 2500 RPM. Oakland Center, Cirrus November 171 Mike Alpha, off Siskiyou, climbing via the ODP.
Cirrus 171 Mike Alpha, sail center, squawk it in.
I'm going to adjust the inset to give me some terrain awareness, and since we're above 3,200 feet, CAPS is available. I'm going to switch to the map page to remind myself that I can use CAPS. Always a good idea to scan CHTs regularly and make sure they're below 380 even when climbing Richard Peak. Alright, we're climbing through 7,000 now, so I'm going to sync the heading bug, set heading mode, and start it on a right turn back towards Montague. And the other thing we can do is take the CDI out of suspend mode and fly a direct course back to Montague so that we can fly using nav mode.
Cirrus 179 Mike Alpha, clear direct Rogue Valley.
Direct Rogue Valley, 171 Mike Alpha. Alright, he's pulling us off the ODP as predicted, so we can simply go direct to Rogue Valley now. Climbing through 10,000 now so we can get the landing light off, turn the oxygen on, set the flow meter. Now in previous videos I adjusted the flow meter every 2,000 feet, but another strategy you can use is just to set it all the way up to your cruising altitude and leave it there for the rest of the flight. You'll use a little bit more oxygen that way, but it's one less thing to think about.
11.
Also in previous videos, I advised you to switch fuel tanks every 15 minutes. That's what I do in real life because I do actually have a 15-minute timer which reminds me in the real airplane, but there's no timer that reminds you in this airplane. So I've started just switching based on the fuel totalizer, the gallons used. I switch at 5 gallons, which we're at now, so we'll switch and check fuel flow. And then I switch every 10 gallons thereafter, so at 15, 25, and so on. It keeps things a little bit more even than just switching every 15 minutes arbitrarily. But in both cases, you're not going to get a reminder from the airplane, so you have to be monitoring the fuel usage yourself. Also, this totalizer may not reset between flights, and so it may not start at 0 gallons for each flight. Alright, looks like we've reached our cruising altitude of 16,000 feet. Now for fuel, for time and fuel, we predicted 15.2 minutes and 9 gallons, and we're coming up at 15 minutes 10 seconds and 7.3 gallons. So we're beating the book on fuel, and the time is working out really closely. Anyway, with all that done, we've got a nice easy cruise ahead of us. I'll check back in, we'll make our approach into Portland, and then we will see how we did on the time and fuel for the total flight. Portland approach, Cirrus 171 Mike Alpha, 16,000 with November.
Cirrus 171 Mike Alpha, Portland approach. Thank you for November, but unfortunately Oscar is now crowd. Give it to you real quick. The wind 3305, 10 miles, and a few clouds at 295,000. Temperature's 19, the altimeter 3007, and you can descend and maintain 10,000. Let me know if you have an approach request.
Descend and maintain 10,000. Visual 28 right will be fine. 171 Mike Alpha.
Roger.
Shadow approach, History Kilo is fine, going missed, pain.
The 5363 Kilo, excuse the public transport procedure, contact Seattle departure 120.4.
Descend at 800 feet per minute, and we'll leave the power where it is.
171 Mike Alpha, turn right heading 030, expected visual approach runway 28 right, descend and maintain 5,000. Cirrus 171 Mike Alpha, turn left heading 310. The Portland airport is at your 11 o'clock, 15 miles above the field in sight.
Left 310 and airport in sight, 171 Mike Alpha.
Cirrus 171 Mike Alpha, cleared visual approach, runway 28 right.
Clear visual 28 right, 171 Mike Alpha. All right, let's do our before landing checks now. So that's going to be gas. We'll turn on the boost pump and switch the tanks one last time. Undercarriage, mixture, we'll go full rich. Propellers, seatbelts, switches, and systems. Bring up the engine page.
Sirius 171 Mike Alpha, contact Portland Tower, 118.7.
187 171 Mike Alpha. Portland Tower, November 171 Mike Alpha on the visual 28 right.
Sirius 171 Mike Alpha, Portland Tower, runway 28 right, clear to land, wind 3205.
Clear to land 28 right, 171 Mike Alpha.
Approach into...
We're getting established, so I'm going to bring the power all the way back. And we're going to slow to the flap speed. There's 119, flaps 50.
2461 heavy is 15-2 descending via the Razor Whiskey.
Current, let me know when you pick up golf.
And flaps 100.
And let me know if you have an approach request.
500.
500 feet, stable, 1 dot low. Gentle flare.
Southwest 130, contact NorCal approach 120.905.
And we can stop before the first taxiway. We can just taxi straight ahead to Atlantic. Yeah, there we go. Go. Let's just come off to the left here. Save ourselves some taxi time. And we'll do our after landing checks. So landing light off. Relean the mixture. And flaps up. Portland Tower, Sirius 171 Mike Alpha, clear at 28 right, taxi Atlantic.
Sirius 171 Mike Alpha, taxi Atlantic via Alpha Alpha 4, remain the street, good night.
Alpha Alpha 4 with you, 171 Mike Alpha. All right, we're parked. Well, let's see how we did. We burned 26 gallons of gas, and we predicted 28.1 gallons of gas. ForeFlight predicted 26 gallons of gas, so ForeFlight's right on the number. Now, of course, there are some discrepancies. ForeFlight includes taxi fuel, whereas we didn't calculate taxi fuel because it's not published for the SR22. And we got a few vectors as well as the departure procedure, which we didn't account for, but all that stuff really doesn't make too much of a difference, and that's why you have the reserves to absorb stuff like that. But all in all, that worked out pretty okay. So we can go ahead and shut down the engine now. So turn on. All right, well, I hope you guys learned a little something about flight planning, performance planning, and altitude planning with the SR22, both with ForeFlight and manually. Of course, I don't think anybody does this stuff manually anymore. Those tables are there if you need them in a pinch. In cruise, if something happens, you need to do some quick recalculations, or if you just want to stay current on the manual stuff just for your own satisfaction. Obviously, most everyone else uses ForeFlight or some other flight planner, but now you know how to do it, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If there's anything else you'd like to talk about with the SR22, just let me know. I can make more videos. But happy flying and stay safe out there.